Okay, so this is a video I'm doing for Domain 1. What I kind of wanted to do is do a short video on each of the domains and stuff I remembered in some notes. And I was originally going to do set up all the GitHub stuff first and have all the stuff ready, but I figured why not just do it while I'm making a video, kind of get the conversation going. So what I'm going to do for each one of these is, you'll see the title when you get to the page, elevator pitch. That's going to be kind of the Cliff's Notes version of it. I'm going to try and go from the top of my head what each of those domains entail. So I don't want to necessarily get the stuff straight from the book or something you can easily Google, just explain it in my own words real fast. So with risk management, there's no such thing as zero risk, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. Just minimal. So you have, like the chance of being struck by lightning, for instance. And when it's raining, you have a higher chance. There might be a possibility of being struck by lightning on a clear day, but the risk is mathematically so small, it's going to be minimal. But there's not a 0% chance of getting, you get the analogy. Or another instance, if you live near an airport, there's a risk a plane could crash into your front yard. Now, if there's no planes flying landing at your airport that day, that doesn't mean the risk is absolute zero, but, because something else can happen. And a plane flying over your area could crash, whatever. But that means the risk is minimal and something manageable. One thing I like to use for lock picking as an example is, if I pick a lock, somebody will ask, well, is that a lock nearby here? No locks. Anyway, somebody will say, what kind of lock should I use for X? I go, okay, well, you go to a gym and you have the locks in your lockers. Do you buy a $300 lock to protect your $50 worth of clothes? Probably not the most feasible way to manage that risk. Alternatively, you can not bring certain things to a locker, like you don't leave your really expensive things in the car or bring them into the gym. Another example I can think of is those door camera things or door locks in your house. So somebody asked me the question of, what kind of lock should I get to protect my house? So, well, once again, you get into the question of, how much stuff do you have to protect aside from yourself? The other downside of that is if you're going to buy some kind of protection for your door is if you get one of those really expensive locks with a camera and all that stuff, especially if you're in apartment complexes, for example, and these are mostly just examples and anecdotal, but think of it this way. You put the really expensive lock on your door and all the sophisticated stuff on it in an apartment complex in, say, a pretty sketchy low-income neighborhood. You kind of start sticking out like a sore thumb and arguably increase that risk a little bit. So and companies deal with this kind of thing all the time where you're just kind of weighing, well, how much should we spend to protect this asset, that asset, what have you? And sometimes those assets might include people or information, things like that. So a lot of what you cover in this chapter and what you'll see in the real world with risk management is calculating all that stuff out. So I mentioned over here about quantitative and qualitative risk. And you won't see these things you don't see these things. Like if you're taking practice tests, it's going to ask things way different than the actual test. I can tell you that much without getting too specific. You'll get more of a dictionary terms of what these things are on most of the practice tests than what you'd probably see in the real world too. So read up on these things and kind of think of real world stories. The one thing that was helpful for me on the exam was, throughout my years of working in IT and even other jobs, just thinking about what goes on when X bad thing happens and how you respond to it. And I don't mean in terms of going through incident management process, but I mean a real good example. You come in on a Monday morning and you see the email threads about some kind of risk assessment. Oh, what's the problem? Oh, a drunk driver crashed in your office building and took out your data center. You could just do a search for this on Google just for news articles, and what did I find? Let's see. Let's see. Wow, that's a bit. So, and one thing I thought of in mind, yeah. What is that? So, like, just out the gate, you look at news stories, you'll find, and that's just recently, like 200,000 results. So, something like that does happen, and what happens as a result of that? You know, you start going into, well, how much damage it costs? What's the recovery look like? All those other things, all those tangible numbers you get, like number of hours, number of this, numbers are going to be leaning more towards your quantitative risk. That's something like you have a very tangible value to associate with that. Qualitative risk, on the other hand, is, well, what about public perception? There's a lot of hemming and hawing about, and I'm writing all the stuff in here as I go. There's a lot of hemming and hawing about that stuff. Like, for instance, the Target breach. You know, there's when that happened, there was, I'm not going to dig up the numbers at the moment, but X amount of $1 million lost, X amount of number of people impacted. You have very specific numbers. The qualitative risk, I'm like, well, what did that do to public reputation? Did people, did less people go to Target? And yeah, you can quantify a number of people that went to Target less after that breach, or more, what have you. But for the qualitative sense, it's like, what did it actually do to public perception? And that's always subjective. Some of the topics to cover, and I get into some of the topics, and granted, whether or not there are questions on the exam, that's depending on your case. But one thing I noticed with studying that I had issues with were any practice questions related to these formulas here. So you have your asset value, exposure factor. Multiplying those, you get your single loss expectancy. So that's like when bad thing happens at one instance. So car gets broken into this time, this one time. What was, how much was lost? And then you say, well, okay, you lose this much. Okay, that's your single loss expectancy. If your car gets broken into, cars get broken into, say, 3 times a year, multiplied by how much you would lose from that one time losing, that's your annual loss expectancy. So if you bought something like, say, a club or any kind of car alarm, any sort of security, that's going to be your safeguard here and how much this costs. So like your ALE before you put the safeguard in place would be all this stuff here. So and then when you're trying to get your total cost, you're subtracting, okay, well, I put the safeguard in place, and now we're going to measure that again. And that's once again your total cost from control types. So let's see. I'm looking at some of the stuff in the book. This is another good book, by the way, the 11th Hour CISSP. I probably actually read stuff in here more than I did this big monster. Don't be fooled. Most stuff here, as I said many times before, is just stuff I highlighted and I can go back to later. And some of the stuff especially that engineering domain, I will probably go back to later just to read up on a little bit because it deep dives into things. But a lot of those things weren't on the exam. So in the 11th hour, it mentions the types of the control types. You'll hear a lot about them, and I'm not doing it scripted, by the way, so I'm going to stammer away. Just had it. Where'd you go? Anyway, so for your control types, you've got your preventive control, detective control, and your corrective control. So there's a bunch of other control types, but I'm not gonna. In all honesty, there weren't really. I didn't really even see a ton of practice questions on them. These are the 3 you'll see the most. So preventive control, like, okay, you have a fence, prevents people from getting in. In this case, a camera would be like a detective control. It doesn't really it won't stop. It may not stop something, and some of these may overlap, like barbed wire fence. Would stop some of that stuff, and with a camera. So your detector controls just looking for things. Well, there's a meme, I can't remember. It showed like one of a Yorkie or like a Chihuahua small dog, and that was described as intrusion detection system. And then there's another one with this like snarling big pit bull next to it called preventive control. And you kind of see the analogy there, like, okay, the little 10-pound Yorkie's probably not going to do all that much to prevent somebody from breaking in, but they'll at least bark and let you know they'll at least bark to notify you. Whereas that preventive control, it might do some barking, but it's definitely there to prevent anything from happening and will respond accordingly. Stuff like corrective controls will be put in place to. Where'd it go? Oh, here we go. This one I am going to read. Correcting a damaged system or process. One thing I hear a lot about is compensating controls. So don't worry, I'll get to the CIA Triad. We'll add that. I'm going to put that up at the top because that's probably the biggest thing you'll see on here, and overlapping it almost everything in the exam. But anyway, back to the control types. Corrective control, compensating control. So when you tell somebody you're working with, hey, we notice you have a thing you need to clean up security-wise. They say, well, we can't do thing right now, but we have this in place, so that'll make this thing a little still lower risk. That's for your compensating control. So a compensating control is basically one of the other controls that may compensate for a lack of in one control or another. And it may not be there as a permanent thing. It may be temporarily, but compensating is where it will fill in a gap where something isn't in place. So let's back up for a minute. I know I skipped over probably the biggest thing on here. And once again, I didn't see a ton of questions. So what is the CIA Triad? Integrity. Let's see. I'm going to put this in my own words. Confidentiality. Do the right people or right... Let me take people out of the equation for a second. Do the right subjects. You're going to hear the whole subject object a lot. Subjects have wait. Let me word that a little different. So, confidentiality. Go to that one real quick. I know these definitions, but I want to try and put them in my own words, so I'm going to read through again. And where are you? So the CIA Triad is any combination of things that make something secure. So does it prevent... Oh, here we go. Allows access authorized subjects while denying access to unauthorized a given object. Okay, so that's that's one way I can put it in my own words, I guess. Basically, keeping something secret. If making sure the only people that have access to said information or thing are the people that should, and anybody that shouldn't have access doesn't. Simplest way I can describe confidentiality. Integrity. Let's see. So we're making sure unauthorized changes can't be made. And namely, one thing you will hear a lot about non-repudiation. So what that means in a nutshell is, how do I prove you're you? And we get in this thing with like voter registration. Like ultimately, it's how do I prove you're you, regardless of how you want to look at that whole thing. I think that's about as brief as I can get with that description. I don't want to make a 45-minute video describing that or of any one specific topic. Just want to keep these simple. Let's see here. And availability is that thing is the thing authorized person want to access available. Let's see. So is the can the authorized subjects yeah. So, and the keyword being can. So you have confidentiality, so the authorized person can do X, and then you know that person's them or thing is them, and then finally, is that resource available? If they have all the access in the world, doesn't mean anything if it's not, if you can't get to it. So I'm me, I can hold my phone. If the phone's not here, if the phone's not available, then my access to it doesn't matter, does it? Let's see. There's that. What else came up a lot? There was some stuff on laws. It didn't really get too specific. One of the big ones you'll hear about is GDPR. I don't remember a ton of questions. Honestly, same with the practice test either. I was like, okay. There were a couple of terms I remember that apply that I just kind of memorized over and over. That was about it. One thing that does come up often, and this is just in work environments a lot, is least privilege, and this goes back to the whole risk management thing. So this term comes up. I should probably describe subject matter first, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Least privilege. So what does this mean? This means that when you give somebody access to something, they get the bare minimum of what they need. Like, if I was letting somebody house sit for me, I might give them the keys to the house, but they don't necessarily need my passwords for my laptop and everything. Or if they want to use the internet while they're here, I would give them like a guest password that lets them do the bare minimum. So access to turn on and off, and if they had access to my house, turn on and off the lights, use the bathroom, like the bare minimum to get them to do what they need to do. And you'll see the same thing in in organizations and how they do manage things with granting access. I've seen it done wrong, and I've seen it done better. In the case of wrong, and what I'm trying to do with this part is tell real world stories, but not really. I'm not going to name names. Aside from the whole ethics thing, and they're not paying me to speak on their behalf. So I can allude to a lot of stories, but chances are they probably happen in your company too. So it's not like this isn't unknown stuff. So least privilege, what does that mean if you're an organization? So you start a new company, you get your access to things. Not everybody in that company will need outlet privileges, even the people that think they do. Sometimes it's just doing the bare, there are certain things you need to do throughout your day, depending on your job. You only need that access. You don't need to have full access to the domain all day long for a certain, unless you're in a role that does that. So least privilege is giving the minimal needed to a subject. Hey, and now giving them access needed for needed use an object. I guess that works. Let's see. What other topics were there in there? You know what? Specifically, I'm going to go with what I was studying, and let's see. So when I did these practice questions, there were some topics let's see. Kind of wrote down. So risk management framework. I don't really remember too much. I wrote on that. The ISOs. Let's see. I'd have to do a whole separate video on those, but in all honesty, I don't remember all that much from them. Big one. So responsibilities. You have different roles, and there's a bunch of them, but depending on, you can usually narrow down to owner, custodian, and user. So what does those mean? Owner. So the owner is going to be kind of the decision maker of all that and this could be data, a system, what have you. So, and what you're doing with in saying with the whole least privileged granting access, an owner might be the one that makes the decisions on things, but they don't necessarily need to do all the things with the object. Even as an owner, like they're there kind of as oversight, saying this is how they should be done. They're the ones writing a lot of the processes and policies in the background. Most of what you see, most of what people interact with on day to day would be, say, the custodian. So that person's going to be giving access, provisioning things, resources. They may know a little bit more than the user in terms of how the thing works, but they're not going to be even the custodians may not always use a product on the daily. So then you have finally your user. Your end user is the person that would just use. They're just using. They might read write into a database, real basic things, or an application, what have you. But you're not going to need to. You don't need to. You're not making a decision at that level. You're not doing things. Like backing up or provisioning access. You're using the resource or the object, what have you. So owners up here, your custodian's down there, and one thing I definitely noticed things you might want to know is what a custodian does. Like they will back up and do the daily operations of they'll handle a lot of the daily operations of how that or who uses that resource, giving out access, deprovisioning when needed, maybe troubleshooting an issue here and there. And ultimately down to the user at the bottom, they'll have probably the least amount of access, but they're probably using the data the most. Let's see. Makes decisions. Come on, type today. Custodian will provision and maintain. User consumes. There we go. Consumer. Better phrasing. There we go. So there's that. Let's see. Control types. Yeah, one example I've seen with the least privileged thing that comes to mind, I half joke about certain places I've worked where they will pretty much give out domain admin with your employee badge. And in some cases, and to be fair, the way that ends up escalating is, companies will be moving really fast, and onboarding is always a hit or miss in places, and same with provisioning or deprovisioning stuff. So in some cases, I half joke about, moving on to another job, and then a year later or so, still having access or still having an account, when that stuff should have been deprovisioned a long time ago. And in some cases, been a month after. In some, it's like the ones doing it right. It's like, okay, badge turned in, done, or even before that. Let's see here. CIA Triad, covered that. Those are the big things. I may add some stuff on here later. I want to keep this video short. I don't want to do like hour-long rants on this stuff. So keeping it under half hour. I'll add some more notes to this, and that's a wrap.